Hello friends, I hope that you are well. Many of you may know that I've done a year's working holiday visa in Australia and a year's working holiday visa in New Zealand, 2015 then 2016. I've made a fair bit of content on each of these. However, I've never made a video actually comparing the two, and I get asked about it all the time, which is better, but it's very subjective. You can't just say, oh, this is better and this is better. They're both good for different reasons. So what I've done is I asked you on Instagram what specifically you want to know about comparing the two, and I got a bunch of questions, so I'm going to answer them for you today. And hopefully it can give you some good information so you can make your mind up about maybe which one you want to do or which one you want to do first. I always think it's a good idea to do both. But anyway, let's get started. What's required for a New Zealand working holiday visa? Which country would you say is easier to apply for a working holiday? How long did it take your New Zealand visa to be approved while you were in Oz? So the requirements for both of the working holiday visas are on the immigration websites of the particular countries. I'll make sure I have every website linked below that I mentioned. As a general idea, you need to be 18 years old, I believe, but not older than 30 or 31. But that rule does vary. You can't have any children that depend on you. You can't have any criminal convictions. You can't be really seriously ill, things like that. But if you check the websites, then you'll be able to get a full list of the requirements. It's not easier to get one or the other. They both have the same process on their website. It's just an online application. You fill all the details out and then you wait for it to get approved. And in terms of how long it takes to get approved, I think, well, they say that you must allow a month, I think, for each of them. You need to allow a month from applying before you arrive in the country to have your visa approved. However, I think my Australia visa to get approved only took 2 days after applying, and my New Zealand visa, I'm not even sure if it took that long. I seem to remember stupidly only applying for my New Zealand visa about a week before I planned on arriving in the country, and yeah, I remember it being approved very quickly though. But they do say that you should allow a month. How expensive are the visas? Which one is cheaper / easier to get or find work? Is the visa for New Zealand free? Neither of them are free. New Zealand is definitely cheaper. I think it's about half the price of the Aussie one. So from memory, again, you should check on the immigration website because I do think that the price changes as the years go by. The Australian one is about 400 Aussie dollars and the New Zealand one is about 200 New Zealand dollars. So you're looking at about Australian £200, New Zealand £100-ish. But neither of them are free. Do the wages stretch far while living in Oz on a working holiday visa? What's the pay like in New Zealand compared to Oz? Which is best to earn money for saving for future travels? So you get paid a lot more in Australia than what you do in New Zealand. To give you an example, I did a few temp office jobs in Sydney. I was getting about 29 Aussie dollars an hour, which equates to about £17 an hour. Really, really amazing. In New Zealand, I had a more skilled reception job in a hotel where I was also working as a concierge. I was earning about 17 New Zealand dollars an hour, which is about £8.50, £9 an hour. So significantly less for a fairly similar job, even more skilled actually, in my opinion. So in terms of saving money and have a lot of money in the bank, Australia is definitely better. Your money goes further, you earn more, you can save money there for future travels. New Zealand, I felt like I was just kind of getting by. It was fine, it was comfortable, but I didn't have any money left over, apart from when I was working for accommodation and had a full-time job, but that was exhausting. That's not a sustainable way to live. What has the higher cost of living? What are the logistics of getting housing? Which is cheaper for housing and food? How does the cost of living differ between countries? How does the pay compare with the cost of living in both places? So all very similar questions there. So I'd say that the cost of living and the cost of food and like your general life expenses between Australia and New Zealand are fairly similar. I'd actually go as far to say that Australia is slightly cheaper than New Zealand, but then Australia you get paid more, and so yeah, it really is a better quality of life in money, financial terms in Australia than it is in New Zealand. But I always suggest in terms of housing, starting off in a hostel and maybe working for accommodation and doing things cheaply like that until you've got a stable job, and then you're able to figure out what kind of accommodation you can afford depending on what job you've got. Some of you might be more skilled and might be able to get a job with a better wage, and then you'll be able to live in a better house, if that makes sense. But yeah, general expenses in both countries are a fairly similar price, but you get paid more in Australia, so you're going to have more money left over. Is it easy to find work in New Zealand than Oz, particularly admin work? How hard is it to find work in New Zealand? Was it easy to get a job in Australia in terms of your skills, or were they not specific? Where it was easiest to get job and where it was hardest, especially in Oz. Generally in both Australia and New Zealand, because you do have a lot of backpackers coming in, the turnover of work throughout the year is fairly high. So I would personally say I don't think it's very hard to get a job in either country, especially if you're looking at doing bar work, waitressing work, office temp work, jobs which are fairly temporary. They're going all the time, and I would say it is quite easy to find that kind of work. If you do want something more skilled and something more specific to you, that's probably a fair bit harder because you're competing with everyone who's in Australia who wants those jobs as well. But if you can prove that you're really good at your job and you can prove that you're worth having, then I can't imagine it would be too difficult for you. And to be a bit more specific with those questions, I didn't get office temp work when I was living in New Zealand, not when I was living in Queenstown. Anyway, if you want office temp work, you've got to go to the big cities, Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, and the same with Australia, Sydney, Melbourne. Though saying that, finding office temp work in Perth, I did find fairly difficult. It took me a good few weeks to get a job, but there's not as many backpackers working in Perth, and I think that's the reason that the turnover is not as high. But the easiest place that I found a job was in Queenstown, and the hardest place was probably Perth, I'd say. Do you know how easy or hard it is to get a job if you don't speak perfectly fluent English? Being a native English speaker, I don't feel like I can answer this question well. I definitely meet backpackers and people working in Australia and New Zealand who are not fluent in English, but they are very good. I don't often meet backpackers who are not that great at English who are working in English speaking countries. If you think you may not be fluent, but you can get by, then yeah, I don't see why you wouldn't be able to get yourself a job, especially if it's something that doesn't really require you to speak to customers. Why should it matter that your English isn't that great? I'm not too sure though, I'm sorry, I haven't been in that position. How hard is it to find waitress jobs in big cities like Sydney/Brisbane after Christmas? I imagine quite easy. Sydney and Brisbane are both very popular with backpackers. The turnover of work is going to be very high, especially waitressing jobs. I don't think you'll have a problem. Are there the same opportunities? Are the job types different in Oz compared to New Zealand? What skills would you recommend have for Australia, New Zealand? The skills that you have at home, you can pretty much get any job when you're working in Australia and New Zealand. And in terms of the job types being different between the two countries, not really, because it just depends on where you are. So in Queenstown, lots of waitress, bar jobs, concierge jobs, hotel reservations, like hotel receptionists and hospitality work, essentially, in Queenstown, where I was. But then if you go to Auckland, Christchurch, or Wellington in New Zealand, they're big cities, and you're going to find the same work there that you are in Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne. Or you could work in a beach town, so Mount Maunganui in New Zealand, you're probably going to find similar jobs to what you would find in Byron Bay in Australia. Does that make sense? So it's not necessarily about the country, it's about the specific types of places that you go within the country. Which city in New Zealand do you think would be the best place to work/live for approx 6 months? Again, it really depends on what you want. So if you love the mountains and adrenaline activities and lots of hiking, I would definitely say Queenstown or Wanaka or Rotorua or Taupo. If you love the beach and water sports, I'd say Kaiteriterri or Mount Maunganui. If you love the city, well, Christchurch, Wellington or Auckland. Is it possible to have a working holiday visa while having remote work from other countries? Yes, definitely. I don't see why not. Though I would argue, why not just go there on a tourist visa and not waste your working holiday? Because I think it's good to make the most of a working holiday when you are actually working in that country. Just my personal opinion. Does New Zealand require the 88 days of regional work like Oz in order to obtain your second visa? How long do you have to do farm work in Oz/New Zealand? So in Australia, you've got to do 88 days of farm work in order to get your second year visa, or at least to be able to apply for it, and then you've got to have that approved. New Zealand is not the same policy. You can apply for 2 years initially in New Zealand. However, I do believe that the rule in New Zealand is that within your 2 years, you can only work for 12 months. So if you apply for your 2 years and you work for the first 12 months, you can stay there for another year, but you can't work unless you've been sponsored. Or you can apply for 2 years and then you can like travel for 6 months and work for 6 months, then travel for 6 months and work for 6 months. I do believe that is the rule for New Zealand, but again, check the immigration website, make sure that that's correct. So you definitely don't have to do the 88 days rural farm work in New Zealand. Do you think New Zealand is easier than Oz to get sponsored for a visa after a working holiday visa? Is it possible to be accepted as a New Zealand resident after doing working holiday? It is definitely easier to get sponsored from your job in New Zealand than what it is in Australia. I would say if you're good at your job and you've kind of proven yourself to be good over the 12 months or however long that you've been working for this company in New Zealand, it's quite likely that they will sponsor you if you ask, or they'll say, hey, like, we'd definitely sponsor you if you wanted to stay another year. I know a lot of friends who have got a sponsorship in New Zealand. Australia is actually another story. It's a lot more difficult to get sponsored. I would say you can only really get sponsored in Australia if you prove to that business that they can't quite function without you. Maybe not quite to that extreme, but it's a lot more difficult. Businesses are much less likely to sponsor you. I don't exactly know the reason for this, but yeah, it's a lot harder. And in terms of residency, this is not something that you can get directly after your working holiday visa. It normally requires being sponsored, or if you have like a de facto visa, for a few years. And when I say a few years, I mean like 5 or 6 years. I don't know the exact amount. And then you might become a permanent resident. But it's not just a case of do a working holiday and then become one. That's not a thing. What place is better for meeting friends? What would you recommend for a first-time traveller? I would say Australia to both of those questions, if I'm honest. I mean, it is subject to people's opinion and also just completely subject to people's experiences in different places. But typically, Australia is where a lot of first-time travellers go, so you definitely wouldn't be alone. You'd be in the same boat as so many other people. And yeah, it's really easy to make friends. But I mean, I would argue it's also very easy to make friends in New Zealand as well, but typically Australia. What are the most common and easy activities to do in both? I asked about easy activities. I meant easy as in accessible. So New Zealand, predominantly hiking. A lot of backpackers will do a lot of hiking in New Zealand. 1, because it's free, and 2, because the views are just absolutely epic. There's also so many adrenaline activities to do in New Zealand as well, but they are significantly more expensive, so that's not the kind of thing that you're going to be doing all the time. In terms of Australia, accessible activities, surfing, hiking, wine tasting, pretty much everything that you can think of, and you've specifically mentioned diving. Lots of diving out in the Great Barrier Reef. Diving in New Zealand, not as common, and it is very expensive, but you definitely can do it on various points around the island by the coast. How much of Australia can I see within 9 months without stress? And do I need a thick fleece jacket? You can see the whole of Australia in 9 months, I would say, especially if you're not working. If you're just traveling, 9 months is for sure enough time. You could do the whole East Coast, you could do the whole West Coast, you could do the Outback, you could do the South. I would say that that's definitely enough time. If you're wanting to work, it depends on how long you're wanting to work for, if I'm honest. And will you need a fleece jacket? Probably, but it depends on where you're going. Like Melbourne and Adelaide and even Sydney and Perth can really get quite chilly in the winter. The whole of Australia is not tropical, not down south anyway. But above Brisbane, that's generally warm all year round. But yeah, I'd say bring a fleece with you. It depends on when you're going. What month you would recommend to start working holiday if you want to do 88 days of regional work right away? Personally, I would start in July or August, because you're going in the Australian winter, which means your 88 days of regional work, just gotta get out the way. It's not gonna be too hot, and then when you finish, it's gonna be going into the summer, and you can travel and you can enjoy it. And yeah, that's what I would recommend. How much should someone budget for a month in New Zealand? About $2,000, maybe 2,500 if you're wanting to do like all the activities. What route would you do if you wanted to travel before settling in one place in New Zealand? Just somewhere that goes everywhere. I recommend having a look at the Kiwi Experience website. They do a bunch of different routes, but make sure you go on a route that takes you all around the North Island and all around the South Island. There's a bunch of ones that you can choose from. Or if you didn't want to do the Kiwi Experience, just have a look on their website and just have a look at the routes, because it's really good for just knowing about the hotspots and whatnot. Shall I risk everything to go to New Zealand for working holiday or permanently? I don't know, what are you risking? I felt like when I went over there, I wasn't really risking too much. I was just like, well, this is what I want to do. Yeah, I don't know what you're risking, so I can't really answer that question. How much money would you recommend taking? For both countries, I would say try to have at least 5,000 Aussie dollars or 5,000 New Zealand dollars in your bank account. It should be enough to travel for a few weeks before you wanted to start work, or you could just chuck yourself into work straight away, and that'll definitely be enough money to kind of keep you going until you get work. Hopefully. That's what the immigration websites recommend anyway. What do you love most about Australia? The lifestyle, and I really liked how you got paid so much, and so you just had so much extra spending money, so you could go out, you can have a good time, you can have fun, and you don't really need to worry too much about your travels. And which one did you enjoy more? Me personally, I enjoyed New Zealand more just because of the experience I had. I was in Queenstown the whole time. I had an epic year. I made such close friends. I really enjoyed the job that I ended up having. When I was in Australia, I kind of went to the country, then left, then came back, and then I was kind of here, there and everywhere. And me personally, I had a lot of struggles in Australia, just in terms of my regional work and just general situation. Not to say that I didn't enjoy it, I still really, really enjoyed my time on a working holiday visa in Australia. But personally, from my experiences, I preferred my year in New Zealand. But if you haven't heard this before, what they say is that New Zealand is better to travel and Australia is better to work. I would say that generally, I would probably agree with that because of the better quality of life in Australia and for working. And New Zealand is just the most epic country to travel ever. But yeah, it's always subject to people's opinions and their personal experiences and just the time that they had. But yeah, that's all of your questions answered. I hope that you enjoyed this video and you got some good information from it, and it's made you think a little bit more about which country you might want to go to or which country you might want to go to first, because I mean, I would obviously recommend that you do both if you have the chance. Thanks again for sending in your questions, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!